Did you know that some US states are so intertwined with Canadian dollars that without them, their economies could crumble? Stay tuned as we uncover the 10 US states most at risk of collapse without Canadian economic influence. Canada is more than just a neighbor to the United States, it's a vital economic partner. With over $700 billion in trade flowing between the two countries annually, the Canadian dollar supports industries, tourism, and local economies across the northern US. But what would happen if that lifeline were severed? Today, we're exploring 10 US states that could face serious economic challenges without the influence of Canadian dollars. Our ranking is based on factors like trade volume, tourism, and economic dependency.
State number 10.
Michigan, known for its automotive legacy, is deeply tied to the Canadian economy. The Detroit-Windsor border crossing alone facilitates over $70 billion in trade annually, making it the busiest land border in North America. Michigan's auto industry relies heavily on Canadian parts, raw materials, and cross-border manufacturing. Canadian investments also bolster sectors like agriculture and technology, further intertwining the state's economy with its northern neighbor. In addition to trade, Canadian tourists play a significant role in Michigan's local economy, spending millions annually on shopping, dining, and entertainment. Cities like Detroit benefit from Canadian sports fans attending games and events. Michigan also imports significant amounts of energy from Canada, including hydroelectric power. The state's vibrant university system attracts Canadian students, contributing to local economies. A significant disruption in this partnership would cripple key industries and affect thousands of jobs. Michigan's unique proximity to Canada makes it one of the states most vulnerable to a loss of Canadian dollars. The Great Lakes also serve as a vital link for shipping goods between Michigan and Canada. Without Canadian economic influence, Michigan's growth and stability would face severe challenges.
State number 9.
New York is another U.S. state heavily reliant on Canadian dollars for economic stability. Border towns like Buffalo thrive on Canadian shoppers, who contribute millions annually to the retail and service sectors. Niagara Falls, a shared natural wonder, attracts millions of Canadian tourists, fueling hotels, restaurants, and local attractions. The state also imports significant amounts of hydroelectric energy from Canada, powering homes and businesses. Cross-border trade between New York and Canada amounts to billions of dollars annually, supporting industries such as manufacturing, agriculture, and technology. New York City, while global in reach, benefits from Canadian investments in real estate and businesses. Canadian students attending prestigious universities in New York bring additional revenue. Cultural exchanges between New York and Canada, including festivals and art exhibits, further solidify this relationship. Transportation links like bridges and railways facilitate seamless economic interaction. Without Canadian tourists and trade, New York's border cities would see a dramatic economic decline. Canadian investments also support infrastructure projects across the state. The financial sector in New York benefits from cross-border partnerships, enhancing global trade capabilities. A sudden reduction in Canadian economic involvement could have ripple effects across New York's diverse economy.
State number 8.
Vermont's picturesque landscapes and strong agricultural base make it a natural partner for Canada. The state exports products like maple syrup, dairy, and craft goods to Canadian markets, generating significant revenue. Ski resorts in Vermont attract thousands of Canadian tourists annually, especially during winter, providing a crucial boost to the state's economy. Small businesses in Vermont's rural areas depend on Canadian customers for survival, from boutique shops to local diners. Cross-border trade contributes billions to Vermont's economy, with Canada being its largest trading partner. Canadian investments in Vermont's renewable energy sector, including wind and solar projects, are vital for sustainability. The state's tourism industry benefits greatly from Canadian visitors exploring its scenic towns and national parks. Canadian dollars also support cultural events and festivals held in Vermont. Education institutions in Vermont attract Canadian students, further enriching the local economy. Farmers in Vermont rely on Canadian markets to sell surplus agricultural products. Vermont's healthcare system benefits from Canadian professionals who work in the state. A decline in Canadian involvement would leave many sectors in Vermont struggling to adapt. The state's proximity to Quebec fosters a unique cross-cultural relationship that boosts tourism and trade. Vermont's local artists and craftspeople depend on Canadian customers for their livelihoods. The absence of Canadian dollars would create an economic vacuum in Vermont's tightly knit communities.
States number 7.
Maine's economy is deeply tied to Canada through trade, tourism, and shared industries. Known for its world-famous lobsters, the state exports millions of dollars worth of seafood to Canadian markets each year. Canadian tourists flock to Maine's coastal towns, spending heavily on accommodations, dining, and recreational activities. Cross-border shopping contributes significantly to local retail businesses, especially in towns near the Canadian border. The state's forestry and paper industries rely on Canadian partnerships for raw materials and distribution networks. Maine's energy sector benefits from Canadian hydroelectric imports, reducing dependence on fossil fuels. Many small businesses, from local inns to art galleries, depend on Canadian visitors for consistent revenue. The state's fishing industry collaborates with Canada to ensure sustainable practices, further strengthening economic ties. Maine's picturesque national parks, like Acadia, are a major draw for Canadian tourists. Cross-border cultural exchanges, including festivals and craft fairs, foster goodwill and economic collaboration. Canadian investments in Maine's renewable energy projects contribute to job creation and technological innovation. The state's healthcare facilities attract Canadian patients, bolstering revenue streams for hospitals and clinics. Without Canadian economic influence, Maine's smaller, tourism-reliant towns would face devastating challenges. The state's agricultural sector also depends on exporting blueberries, potatoes, and dairy products to Canadian buyers. A reduction in Canadian involvement would disrupt supply chains and lead to economic instability across Maine. State number 6. Minnesota shares a robust economic relationship with Canada, its largest trade partner. The state's agricultural sector relies heavily on Canadian markets, exporting grains, livestock, and dairy products across the border. Canadian investments in Minnesota's manufacturing industry create thousands of jobs and fuel technological advancements. Cross-border trade generates billions of dollars annually, making Canada a cornerstone of Minnesota's economy. The tourism industry also thrives on Canadian visitors, particularly in the state's lake regions and winter resorts. Minnesota's healthcare institutions benefit from Canadian patients seeking specialized treatments. Canadian energy imports, particularly hydroelectric power, play a critical role in the state's energy grid. Minnesota's forestry industry collaborates with Canada on sustainable practices and timber trade. The transportation sector depends on Canadian routes for moving goods efficiently, especially through railways and trucking. Cross-border cultural exchanges, including sports events and festivals, foster strong community ties. Canadian students attending Minnesota universities contribute to local economies and enrich the academic environment. Retail businesses in Minnesota see a steady influx of Canadian shoppers taking advantage of favorable exchange rates. Without Canadian dollars, the state's border towns would face a sharp decline in economic activity. Minnesota's technology sector benefits from Canadian partnerships and investments in research and development. A disruption in this partnership would leave many of Minnesota's industries struggling to recover.
State number 5.
Montana's vast landscapes and rural economy are closely linked to Canadian dollars. The state's agricultural exports, including wheat, beef, and barley, find a significant market in Canada. Canadian tourists are a lifeline for small towns near the border, boosting revenue from hotels, restaurants, and recreational facilities. National parks like Glacier attract thousands of Canadian visitors, particularly during peak travel seasons. Montana's forestry industry depends on cross-border collaboration for timber exports and sustainable practices. The state's transportation sector relies on Canadian trade routes to move goods efficiently. Cross-border shopping is a key contributor to local economies in Montana's border towns. Canadian investments in Montana's energy sector, particularly in wind and solar, create jobs and promote sustainability. The state's tourism industry benefits from Canadian winter sports enthusiasts visiting ski resorts. Without Canadian dollars, Montana's rural communities would face severe economic challenges. Healthcare facilities in the state also serve Canadian patients, adding to local revenue. Cultural events and festivals in Montana often attract Canadian participants, enriching community interactions. Montana's fishing and hunting industries see significant activity from Canadian outdoor enthusiasts. The state's universities attract Canadian students, who contribute to local economies and foster academic exchanges. A reduction in Canadian economic influence would ripple across Montana's industries, leaving many struggling to adapt. The state's reliance on Canadian trade and tourism underscores its vulnerability to any disruptions in this partnership.
State number 4.
North Dakota's economy is heavily reliant on Canadian trade and investment, particularly in the energy and agriculture sectors. The state's oil and gas industry benefits from Canadian partnerships, including pipeline infrastructure and technology sharing. Cross-border trade contributes billions to North Dakota's economy, making Canada its largest export market. The agricultural sector depends on Canadian buyers for crops like wheat, soybeans, and corn. Canadian tourists frequently visit North Dakota's cultural events and shopping centers, bolstering local businesses. Retail outlets near the border thrive on Canadian shoppers seeking deals and unique products. The state's transportation industry relies on Canadian trade routes for efficient goods movement. Renewable energy projects in North Dakota receive Canadian investments, promoting sustainability and job creation. Canadian students attending North Dakota universities bring additional revenue and cultural diversity. The state's healthcare facilities serve Canadian patients, enhancing cross-border collaboration. Without Canadian dollars, many small towns in North Dakota would face economic decline and reduced job opportunities. The state's livestock industry benefits from Canadian markets and cross-border breeding programs. Cultural exchanges, including sports and music festivals, strengthen ties between North Dakota and Canada. The state's rural economies are particularly dependent on Canadian economic activity for stability. Any disruption in this partnership would create significant challenges for North Dakota's industries and communities.
State number 3.
Alaska's unique geographical position makes it heavily dependent on Canadian economic activity. Canadian tourists contribute millions annually by exploring Alaska's breathtaking national parks, glaciers, and wildlife. The state's fishing industry, one of its economic pillars, collaborates closely with Canadian markets for exports and sustainable practices. Canadian energy imports, particularly natural gas, play a critical role in Alaska's energy infrastructure. Cross-border transportation routes, including highways and rail systems, are vital for trade and logistics. Alaska's cruise industry relies on Canadian ports as key stops, connecting the state to international tourists. Canadian investments in Alaska's mining sector boost local economies and create jobs. Retail businesses in Alaska benefit from Canadian shoppers, especially during peak tourism seasons. The state's agricultural exports, though limited, find a steady market in Canada. Educational institutions in Alaska attract Canadian students, adding to local economic activity. Healthcare facilities in Alaska serve Canadian patients, contributing to cross-border collaboration. The state's renewable energy projects receive Canadian investments, fostering sustainability and innovation. Without Canadian dollars, Alaska's economy would face severe disruptions, particularly in its tourism and fishing sectors. Cultural exchanges, including Indigenous partnerships, strengthen ties between Alaska and Canada. The state's reliance on Canadian infrastructure and trade underscores its vulnerability to any economic shifts.
State number 2.
Washington state's economy thrives on its close ties with Canada, its largest trading partner. The state's ports handle billions of dollars in goods destined for Canadian markets, supporting the logistics and transportation industries. Canadian tourists visiting Seattle and other cities contribute significantly to Washington's retail, hospitality, and cultural sectors. Cross-border trade in agriculture, including apples, wheat, and seafood, forms a vital part of the state's economy. The technology sector in Washington benefits from Canadian partnerships in research and innovation. Canadian students attending Washington universities bring additional revenue to local communities. Hydroelectric power from Canada supplements Washington's energy needs, promoting sustainability. The state's healthcare facilities serve Canadian patients, enhancing cross-border cooperation. Retail businesses in Washington's border towns thrive on Canadian shoppers seeking deals. Without Canadian dollars, many small towns in Washington would face economic instability and job losses. Cultural events, including music festivals and sports tournaments, attract Canadian participants and audiences. The state's forestry industry collaborates with Canada for sustainable timber trade. Washington's proximity to British Columbia fosters strong economic and cultural ties. The tourism industry benefits from Canadian visitors exploring the state's scenic landscapes and national parks. A disruption in this partnership would create challenges across multiple industries, highlighting Washington's economic reliance on Canadian influence.
State number 1.
Pennsylvania's diverse economy benefits greatly from its economic ties with Canada. The state's manufacturing sector exports billions of dollars in goods to Canadian markets, including machinery, chemicals, and electronics. Canadian investments in Pennsylvania's energy sector, particularly natural gas, create jobs and support infrastructure development. Tourism is another vital area, with Canadian visitors exploring Pennsylvania's historical landmarks and cultural attractions. Cross-border trade supports thousands of jobs in industries ranging from agriculture to transportation. Retail businesses in Pennsylvania see significant activity from Canadian shoppers, especially during holiday seasons. The state's universities attract Canadian students, contributing to local economies and fostering academic collaboration. Healthcare facilities in Pennsylvania serve Canadian patients, enhancing cross-border cooperation. Cultural exchanges, including music and art festivals, strengthen ties between Pennsylvania and Canada. The agricultural sector relies on Canadian markets for dairy, poultry, and grain exports. Canadian investments in Pennsylvania's technology industry promote innovation and job growth. Without Canadian dollars, many small towns in Pennsylvania would face economic challenges. The state's transportation infrastructure depends on Canadian trade routes for efficient logistics. Canadian partnerships in renewable energy projects foster sustainability and economic growth. Pennsylvania's reliance on Canadian dollars underscores its vulnerability to any disruptions in this economic relationship. The state's diverse industries make it a prime example of how deeply interconnected the U.S. and Canadian economies are. Canada and the United States share one of the world's strongest economic relationships, and these 10 states highlight just how interconnected the two countries are. Canadian dollars don't just fuel trade, they sustain jobs, businesses, and communities. Without this vital connection, the economic landscape of these states could change dramatically. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments, did your state make the list? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content.